So, welcome everybody to the Simcoe County Museum's Black History Month virtual lecture series. Today is our last lecture of the month. So, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to see you all. I'm actually going to start the lecture off with our land acknowledgement. So, the County of Simcoe acknowledges that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg Nation, which includes the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We also recognize the Huron-Wendat who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. We embrace the enduring presence and partnership of the Indigenous peoples of this region, including the Chippewa Tri-Council First Nations, comprised of the Bosley First Nations, the Chippewas of Rama, and the Georgina Island First Nations. We would also like to recognize the diverse Métis and Inuit communities within our region. The County of Simcoe is dedicated to honoring our Indigenous history and culture and is committed to coming together to learn, heal, and create future prosperity, respect, and understanding in all of our communities. And then I just have a brief, so we do have a trigger warning. The following content may contain graphic details about the horrific experiences of slavery, and they may include violence, abuse, and dehumanization, which can be triggering for some participants. I'm going to move on to introduce our lecturer. So Dr. Natasha Henry-Dixon is an assistant professor of African Canadian history at York University. She is an award-winning author and an award-winning curriculum developer. Dr. Henry-Dixon is a 2025 recipient of the King Charles III Coronation Medal in recognition of her leadership and ongoing work to advance understanding of Black history in Ontario. Her research and publications deal with the enslavement of Black people in Ontario, their quest for freedom, the commemoration of Emancipation Day, and Black communities in the province. Her publications include the books Emancipation Day, Celebrating Freedom in Canada, which came out in June 2010, Talking About Freedom, Celebrating Freedom in Canada, which came out in 2012, and a number of youth-focused titles and several entries for the Canadian Encyclopedia on African Canadian history. Recently, her biographical series with the Dictionary of Canadian Biography on the lives of a select number of Black people enslaved in colonial Ontario was released. Dr. Henry-Dixon's most recent public history projects include the self-guided walking tour tracing Mary Ann Shadd Cary's footsteps in mid-19th century Black Toronto. She is the curator for the new archives of Ontario's exhibit, Illuminate Black, Shining Light on the Black Presence in Ontario. Dr. Henry-Dixon's multifaceted works reflect her unwavering commitment to researching, preserving, and sharing the histories of Black Canadians and making her a vital voice in the field. I'm going to pass it on over to Natasha. Welcome, Natasha.
Good afternoon, Meredith, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with your audience. It's the County of Simcoe. It's a pleasure to, be part of efforts to share more about the rich, extensive Black history in this province. Today, my talk focuses on George Martin. And remembering him in his plight from slavery to freedom in Upper Canada, which is now the province of Ontario. Um, to begin with, because of the occasion of the lecture series, I think it's important for the lives and the experiences of Black people who were enslaved in what we now call Canada, that their lives and their experiences be included as part of Black history broadly, but also rightfully so, Canadian history, part of Canadian history of this country and of this nation. And so for me, the work that I've been doing over the course of, I would say about 10, almost 10 years now, has focused on the experiences and the lives of the men, women, and children who were enslaved in colonial Ontario. And so, just to give a bit of context around my research on that and the context of George Martin's life, that people of African descent, Black people, have been enslaved in what we now call Canada for just over 200 years, both under the French and British regimes. And in the British colonies that came to be Canada, the numbers have varied in the different colonies, and how slavery was experienced was both similar but also had some distinctions for a variety of reasons. But overall, there were at least 5,000 Black people who were enslaved between the 1620s up until the early 1830s. Um, of those, what my research has been focusing on, working on finishing up my manuscript. I focus specifically on those who were enslaved in Upper Canada. And so I've been doing that for quite a number of years through my doctoral research. And as I said, I've continued working on publishing my book. And I've done this through my ongoing project called One Too Many, Black people enslaved in early Ontario between 1760 and 1834. And so here is my project website, and there are some information around my research and talks. Meredith highlighted the recent biographies that I wrote for the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and so there's information there. This will also be where, once my book is released, a publicly available open access database that highlights those individuals that I've come to research. And through my research, I have identified at least 650 Black men, women, and children who were enslaved in Upper Canada during the time period that I just mentioned. This map is a distribution of the Black people who were enslaved in Upper Canada between 1770 and 1830. So you get a sense that slavery was common. It was across southwestern Ontario. You see that there are, in some places, higher densities of those who were enslaved, and this often depended upon the number of people that were enslaved by individuals. So, for example, where you see the higher concentrations in the Western District on the very left, that's attributed to Matthew Elliott, who was a superintendent of Indian Affairs and was known to have enslaved at least between 50 and 60 Black individuals. The other higher concentration in the Hamilton area is attributed to the at least 50, again, men, women, and children who were enslaved by Mohawk Chief Joseph Brett. And so you see from, the Detroit River across to the border of with Quebec that slavery was a commonly practiced institute. And so through my research, I take quite a look at that. You'll also notice the higher density in the Niagara region. And, the numbers here were also large because of the number of people who were held by individuals, not necessarily by one individual. And Niagara is a strategic point for the increase in the transportation, the importation of enslaved people during and after the American Revolution. It's so important to note as well when we look at the institution of slavery under the French, there were there were people who were enslaved, both indigenous and Black. The breakdown of that demographics was primarily those who were indigenous comprised of 2/3 of the enslaved population in New France, more in Eastern Canada, including Quebec, and 1/3 were Black people. Under the British, post 7 Years' War in 1760, the demographic shifted to be primarily on almost exclusively Black. And then subsequent to the American Revolution, those numbers grew drastically. Those numbers grew drastically, and so it is in that context that George Martin is born into slavery in the Niagara area. You may have heard of the story of Chloe Cooley and that incident and its significance to Ontario history. Chloe Cooley was a Black woman who was enslaved by Adam Vrooman in Queenston, just beside Niagara on the Lake today. And Adam Vrooman, with the assistance of about three other loyalists, several men from the Van Avery family, violently bound, restrained, and tied up Chloe Cooley and put her in a boat so that Adam Vrooman could sail across the Niagara River and sell her into slavery in America through New York. There were a couple of people who observed this incident, one of them being Peter Martin, a Black loyalist. Peter Martin then brought with him a white laborer by the name of William Grizzly to report this incident to the Executive Council of the Parliament. As a result, charges were laid against Vrooman. However, the charges had nothing to do with the violence that he inflicted upon Chloe Cooley because she was his property. And so he could do with her what he would. Instead, he was charged with breaches of the peace. And so in this report to the Executive Council, they described what happened. Unfortunately, nothing could be done to save Chloe Cooley by that time after the incident. But the government used this incident to introduce legislation to try to abolish slavery. However, they were not successful because at least half of the politicians at that time themselves were enslavers and enslaved, and not quite a number of Black people in the Niagara area. And so the compromise was legislation that gradually abolished slavery. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a moment. But what is interesting about this, this situation, when you examine it closely, we can infer that George Martin would have had a relationship, interactions with Chloe Cooley based on perhaps the work that they were doing, and was familiar with her. George Peter Martin was enslaved by the Butler family, Colonel John Butler and his family in New York. And during the American Revolution, he was actually captured by the Patriots, stolen as property. He was not a prisoner of war because, again, he was property. He and another gentleman who was also enslaved by Colonel Butler. Those two men were able to, at some point over the course of a few months, finally able to escape and made their way to the Niagara area, where they would go on to serve in various capacities in Butler's Rangers. And following the close of the War for Independence, these gentlemen gained their freedom. And so Peter Martin was, for all intents and purposes, a Black loyalist. He had received his freedom. However, Peter Martin, he had family members with him. He had two children, son, George, who we're going to learn more about today, and a recently born daughter named Jane. And they continued to be enslaved by Colonel Butler. And so it's here that I want to delve more into George Martin's life, someone who was more than likely born into slavery in Niagara or imported while he was an infant, and his experiences. So all of this is taking place in Newark, which was the name of the then new capital for the colony of Upper Canada, which came to be then known as Niagara, and today that we now know to be Niagara on the Lake. And the presence of enslaved people in this area, as I said, occurred just immediately after the start of the American Revolution, because a lot of the loyalists, the military, the British military, set up Niagara as part of their defense. And so loyalists brought with them the people that they enslaved. And following the American Revolution, again, the numbers grew, and this was actually also a location through which various enslaved people were imported and then later sold to other loyalists and other settlers. One example being a young girl by the name of Sophia Pooley, who was kidnapped during the war, brought into Niagara. She was kidnapped in New York, brought into Newark, and then was sold to Joseph Branch, who I had mentioned earlier. So Peter Martin was a father of two children, as I said, and they remained enslaved by the Butler family. The children in 1796, the children being George and Jane were bequeathed by Colonel John Butler to his own children and grandchildren in his will. Butler willed Jane to his granddaughter Catherine and bequeathed George to his namesake grandson John Butler. Both of these grandchildren were the offspring of Butler's son, Lieutenant Thomas Butler. Colonel Butler also left an enslaved woman named Pat to his other son, Andrew Butler. Given the circumstances, it is more than likely that Pat was the mother of both of Peter Martin's children, or at the very least, just the mother of Jane, and played a motherly role to George. It is not known after this will what became of baby Jane, but we do learn a little bit more about George. This will is one of several wills that I've uncovered in my research that again are, the part of the vestiges of the institution of slavery right here in Ontario, where it was common under property law for Black men, women, and children to be passed on to children, to grandchildren, to wives, and to continue the enslavement of these individuals rather than free them, so that these families could continue to benefit from their forced labor. So in 1797 is when we get some more information about George. So this is, less than a year after the will of Colonel Butler and his subsequent death. And so the ownership, if you will, of George and Jane and Pat were then passed on to, or George and Jane were passed on to Thomas Butler in care of his children because they were young at the time. In 1797, Peter Martin submitted a petition on behalf of himself and his family because he was on a mission to secure his children's freedom, particularly George. In 1797, Peter Martin arranged to purchase his son George from Thomas Butler, and he needed to be able to do so. As I mentioned, Colonel Butler had passed away in May of 1796. In this petition, what we have is Peter Martin lobbying Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe for the land grant that his deceased brother Richard was entitled to for his military service. In the petition, Martin explained that he wanted to sell the land so that he could raise the sum of 60 pounds New York currency so that he could buy the freedom of his son. You see here, I highlighted in the petition, he says, for the purpose or purposing to ransom his son who lives at Thomas Butler's, which he understands he may accomplish for the sum of 60 pounds New York currency or thereabout. He says that he needs his son for assistance and for support because he himself was lame. So perhaps he was injured during the war and was disabled. And so by this time, George would have likely been a tween or a young teenager. Peter Martin, was awarded the land grant of 300 acres, and it seems that he was successful in purchasing his son's freedom. Along with this plot of land of his recently deceased brother that he acquired, he also purchased for a very small sum the land grant of a fellow Black loyalist. So again, it seems that there was quite a bit of deliberation and planning to acquire a large amount of land so that Peter could then sell it and gain and secure, purchase his son's freedom. So back to the legislation that I mentioned previously that was influenced by the Chloe Cooley incident. And as I mentioned that most of the politicians were against the outright abolition of slavery. And that had come about because there had been whispers that Simcoe was an abolitionist and that he would abolish slavery. And that had actually also influenced the Chloe Cooley incident because Adam Vrooman, in his response to the charges that were laid against him, noted that enslaved people themselves in Niagara were whispering that freedom was coming under Simcoe. And so he and several other enslavers, what they sought to do was to sell the people that they enslaved into New York so that they would try to avoid any financial losses should slavery be abolished. And so that was one of the reasons why Chloe Cooley was sold. So the compromise to outright abolishing slavery was the introduction of gradual abolition. With this legislation, an act to prevent the further introduction of slaves to limit the terms of contract for servitude. And so under this legislation, and again, the context around George's life. First and foremost, this legislation did not abolish slavery at all. In the very first clause, as I provide the excerpt here on the left, noted that anyone who was enslaved at the time that this legislation passed in July of 1793, that they would remain slaves for life, that nothing of their condition would change. It then went on to outline what gradual abolition would look like, noting that children who were born after 1793 would be were born into slavery and could be then freed at the age of 25. And then when those children had children, they would be born free. So over the course of about two generations, going into the 1820s, if things were to follow in line, that slavery would gradually be abolished. It also outlined the ways in which they were encouraging the transition from forced labor, enslaved labor, to indentured labor, which is a different kind of labor situation. And then also outlined that enslavers or former enslavers, once they manumitted those that they had enslaved, had to take some kind of financial responsibility for those individuals so that those recently freed would not become public charges. And so this is, in a nutshell. So George seems to be situated in within this dynamic as having been born prior to 1793, and therefore he could have been enslaved for his entire life. And so his father was able to, as I said, successfully purchase his freedom. So what happened to George after this occurred, after he seems to have gained his freedom? George, if I will just kind of talk about here, George and his father, Peter, moved to the town of York, which is now Toronto. And they show up in the early census records. They are enumerated in the census records of 1801 and 1802. So George Martin is noted as being a Black man in Toronto, along with another male who was young age and whose name is not provided. And so Peter would have been the head of the household, and then a younger person was enumerated with him, and that would have been George. So fast forward 15 years later, and George Martin again comes up in records as having enlisted as a private in the Colored Corps and having served in the War of 1812. And so this brings George back to Niagara, where he grew up and was enslaved as a young person. While he was enslaved, he would have performed, all kinds of duties, whether it would have been supporting the work that Pat had to do, supporting the work that his father would have done. Peter Martin, his father, would have labored for wages for Colonel Butler as well as other loyalists in that vicinity. And so George, as a young person, would have, supported that kind of labor. And as he continued to grow, would have performed all manner of whatever was needed by his enslavers, by Colonel John Butler, and then Thomas Butler when he moved further down the road to Thomas Butler's property. So he returns to Niagara and enlists in the Colored Corps, and that is the unit, the militia of all Black men who served in the Niagara area. The majority of these men were Black loyalists, like Peter Martin, who had been enslaved in the United States, served in the British military for their freedom, and then resided in Niagara and other parts in Upper Canada for, and on land that they had acquired for their freedom. And so many of these men, again, formed this unit. And George Martin was part of that. And one of the more known men who served in this unit was Richard Pearpoint. And so what brought these men together to serve in this militia was the threat of American expansion and American victory, which could lead to the end of their newfound freedom and the reintroduction and the expansion and the solidification of slavery. And so George served throughout the entire course of the war, as he shows up in the military records, the pay list of the Colored Corps. And he served along, as I said, with at least 55 men during the course of that conflict. After the end of the war ended in 1815, and the following year, George submitted a land petition, a petition seeking land in the Niagara area as a child of a veteran of the American Revolution. Children who were children of veterans of the American Revolution were entitled to 200 acres of land. He had also qualified for land for his service with the Colored Corps under the War of 1812. And in his petition, we learn a bit more about George's family life, primarily learning that by the time he had submitted this petition in 1816, his father Peter had passed away. 3 years later, in 1819, George received a land grant certificate. He subsequently would sell this land grant, and he remained and returned to Niagara to reside there. And it is through this time now, having, transitioned into living a life of freedom, being a veteran, that George goes on to civilian life, working as a laborer, but he does face some challenges in his life in freedom. So through my research, again, in trying to better understand George and encountering him in the records, I learned that George would be incarcerated for a few times, beginning in 1829. In 1829, he was charged with theft after he stole a large portion of white fish from a merchant. And we learned through those records that George was a day laborer who had worked occasionally. And so it appears that circumstances of challenges, of hunger, of poverty, led to George stealing these items. And between the years of 1829 to 1838, George had several encounters with the law, including charges for assault and battery, breaching the peace, unpaid debt, theft, and vagrancy. He himself was also the victim of an assault in 1832 that occurred while he was in jail. These incidences were interconnected and had a snowball effect that resulted in George Martin being incarcerated on and off during that time period. And so, he's he's charged with, some of these different charges that seem to be connected. And again, appeared to highlight the challenges, the economic, the financial, the social challenges that George has faced. And it appears that he is by himself without any family members, no wife, no children. His father had passed away. And again, it is not known what happened to Pat, his motherly figure, or his sister Jane. In September of 1832, after subsequent charges and remands in jail, George was ordered banished as punishment for 5 years for the simple act of stealing an axe. But again, this would have been, because of the accumulative charges. Instead of being banished from the colony, however, he was instead retained in jail from October of 1832 until July of 1833. So almost a year. And he was incarcerated in the Niagara jail. Pictured here in this picture. By this time, it is no longer the jail because they had erected a new one. But he was jailed in the Niagara jail for those durations. While he was incarcerated in 1836, 1837, over that winter, George lost one of his legs to frostbite. Court records declare that his feet were so badly frozen that the doctor found it necessary to amputate one of his legs below the knee, and has to have his other leg was in such a state as to reduce him to walk on that one knee. The doctor actually filed a request with the magistrates of the court asking for support for George Martin, financial support. However, they turned down that request. At that time, there was not a poorhouse or a house of industry in the Niagara areas. And so any requests for support by the town, charitable support from the town had to be submitted to the courts, to the magistrates. And so these magistrates, despite George's condition, they denied his request. However, a few months later in 1838, after another request, George was able to get some support for housing, so he was not incarcerated. And the courts actually paid a woman to provide him with room and board in 1838. However, by the fall of 1839, George was homeless, effectively homeless, and living on the streets. Another request was for aid was made on his behalf, again pleading to the magistrates for support. Um, in this request, he was described as having to walk on his knees, described him as being in such a poor state that he is incapable of taking care of himself, even in the smallest degree, and that he is dependent solely on charity, or as they describe it, the cold hand of charity for sustaining his life. And the petitioners, community members, then also said that, if he doesn't get support, he's not going to live long. Um, he did receive private charity for 6 years, not through the courts, for the following 6 years until he passed away in 1845 at about the age of 50 years old. And these are, again, is documented in the records. Something that is quite interesting to me and is seemingly full circle in terms of his life in slavery and freedom is that when George passed away, he didn't have any family. And so the responsibility or the cost of his burial and his funeral service would become a public expense. And so this expense was actually approved by Justice of the Peace Thomas Butler Jr., who was the son of Lieutenant Thomas Butler, the family who had enslaved George and his father and his sister and his mother. Um, and so this was the child of the Lieutenant Thomas Butler. And so again, it's quite interesting because here you have Thomas Butler approving the burial expense to be paid by the town, and which raises a lot of questions. How much support did George receive from the Butler family, who also lived in that vicinity? And as we see here, Thomas Butler Jr. was a justice of the peace. Did he receive any support knowing that their family had benefited from his forced labor while he was enslaved as a young child and benefited from the forced labor of his father, quite frankly, as well? Um, it raises, quite a number of questions. And so this is where um, his story ends. And I've been able to piece together fragments of George's life from slavery to freedom in Upper Canada. His story is quite fascinating to me because um, he was a child born into slavery, likely in this province. He gained his freedom due to the persistence of his father. He chose to exercise his agency to serve, enlist and serve in the Colored Corps during the War of 1812, comprising one of the almost 60 free Black men who served. He secured a land grant and he endeavored to live his life as best as he could, um, you know, and then faced a lot of challenges, which resulted in him losing his legs. And his story is one of the few stories I've been able to trace of someone who was enslaved as a child in Upper Canada and then would go on to gain their freedom and live and die in freedom. One of the few stories that I've been able to trace. Stories like George and as I said, the over 650 enslaved individuals that I've been able to identify, their stories are important to tell uh, within the wider narrative of Canadian history, that their lives, that their experiences do matter, that they do need some historical attention and interpretation, and that it helps us to again understand the complexities of Canada's history that we need to recognize, acknowledge our own history of slavery. Oftentimes, when I see conversations about slavery in Canada, people will say, well, technically Canada didn't have slavery because Canada wasn't a nation until 1867. They will say, well, the British abolished slavery, again, without any recognition of the fact that under the British, the slave trafficking and enslavement of Black people grew, and that Britain was the largest slave trafficker and enslaver, for a couple of centuries. All of that seems to be negated. And in that effort, then what that does is it negates and erases the very real experiences of these individuals. And it also highlights the way that there is a selective embracing of certain aspects of our history, and then the denial, if you will, or marginalization of others, and particularly our history of slavery. And so it's through, my work that I want to continue to document their lives, to tell their stories, and to help people to learn more and appreciate their stories. And so for me, during Black History Month and throughout the year, it's important that their stories be recognized as part of the wider Canadian narrative. I mentioned that George and his father resided in Toronto for a number of years. Through this walking tour that I developed, Brought in Bondage, Black People Enslaved in the Town of York, I also provide more insight into the approximately 15 individuals who were enslaved in the town of York. During the time when the town became the capital of the colony. And it is among this small Black community that George and his father resided and worked and socialized. And so, again, this helps us to better understand, again, through a very localized way, some of these stories. So I'll end here so that it can open up the floor for some of your questions.
Perfect. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions, Natasha? I actually have a question, and
Sure.
yeah, so I was actually wondering, so you found these like all these names, like the 650 names. What avenue how many like how did you find them? And what avenues did you have to go through to find them? Because I feel like it wouldn't be like just obviously like there. You'd have to kind of do some like
Mhm. A lot of
detective.
is extensive research. And I should say that, and I'll just go back to my very first slide actually, that I've been able to identify 650 people at least through various means. And interestingly, your question around names, I've actually been able to, those who were named are about a third
Okay.
of those of the 650, and the majority of them were not identified. So if you look at the first two names, for example, the first two in here, Negro man, Negro woman, they show up either in that way. So they're unnamed but gendered, but a lot of times they're just identified as Negro, and Negro coming to be right synonymous with being enslaved. And so, my research, I've gone through existing research, which quite interestingly has not been extensive for Upper Canada. Some earlier scholarship uh, has provided some leads, and again, the more contemporary, that, that thin amount of research available provided some leads, but I spent quite a bit of time going through a range of archival records, military records, church records, some personal correspondence, diaries, um, newspapers. People who were enslaved were put up for sale in, local newspapers, or runaway notices were placed in order to try to retrieve them. So those are some of the kinds of records that I've combed through to identify people. And again, as I mentioned, going back here, wills of loyalists and early settlers who were enslavers. There are quite a number of wills that highlight some of these individuals.
Well, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Yes.
Does anybody
Um,
else have any questions?
I do. Do you think that you'll ever get to find out what happened to Pat or Jane, like in your research? Like, do you think it'll lead you to figure out what might have?
I have not, and to be honest, it's those kinds of walls to research, if you will, are hard to grapple with, because you want to find them, you want to learn more about their experience, but the reality for so many of those individuals, and I'm just, broadly, but specific to those I've been researching Upper Canada, that sometimes they only show up in one record, and sometimes they're only Negro, and that's, you just know that this was just someone who was enslaved, and you never learn anything more about them. You don't know um, anything about their lives. Those who were in the Niagara area, for example, were Pat and Jane. And because, Jane was an infant, so she would have likely been with her mom, Pat. Were they then also sold across into New York, because they don't seemingly show up in any Niagara records. But then there were also fires that happened, and then records were lost. And so, there's a lot that contributes to their stories being lost to history, that you just sometimes I have to grapple with, that there's only so much, there's only so far I could go in telling their stories.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think,
Hmm.
sorry, to build on that, do you think that it's easier then to find more on like the male aspect of it because you have military records on top of that? And different types of labor and census records?
It was pretty much the same, actually. And I'm excited for my book to get out in the world, to, you'll see some more of those stories. It's interesting how women show up in the stories. I did write about an enslaved Black woman named Bet, who was enslaved in Belleville. And I wrote this a few years ago. It's in the book Unsettling the Great White North, the edited collection. And so, I write about her. There's, so there are some women who show up in the record, and you can tell you do have a bit more of their stories. And so it's not necessarily influenced by gender in terms of how much they show up in the records.
Okay, cool. Thank
Mhm.
you.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions?
While, if
No?
anyone's thinking, I'll just share, as was shared in my introduction there, Meredith shared the biographies of enslaved people that I wrote for Dictionary of Canadian Biography. You can find them on their website. I did biographies for name unrecorded. Again, so that speaks to the majority of those individuals who are unnamed in the records. Chloe Cooley, Henry Lewis, Peggy, Peter, and George Martin, and John Baker. And so I encourage you to read these biographies. To learn more again about these individuals. And then lastly, I will share that an exhibit that I curated, a very new exhibit just opened yesterday to the public for the Archives of Ontario called Illuminate Black, Shining Light on the Black Presence in Ontario, was open to the public, and it will run for 2 years until March 2028 at least. So I again invite you to pop into the Archives of Ontario when you're, in that vicinity to experience this exhibit.
Perfect. Yeah, we do have a comment in the chat. It was from
Oh,
Cheryl. She said, "Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. Amazing histories of amazing people. Thank you."
thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm definitely going to go and check out the exhibit. I'm really excited about it actually, so I'll probably have to go and check it out. But thank you so much, Natasha, for joining us today. It was so great to hear the story of George Martin. I think we need to hear more of these stories and really appreciate, Black history, not just in February, but throughout the whole
Mhm.
year. So thank you so much for joining us, and everybody else, thank you for joining us. I hope you have a really great day.
You're welcome. Thank you.